Welcome to Northwest Tech Show. I'm Dave Duncan, and this is the show where we talk about technology and about how a better understanding of it can help you achieve better results at home, at work, and in your civic engagement. We're going to kick things off, as we like to do, with a clip from the good folks at twit.tv, Creative Commons.
This is Twit.
Obviously, it's hard to talk about this topic and not start at the very beginning of this story, which kind of puts a smile on my face, because I remember the movie Enemy of the State. I remember that I haven't watched it any time since it came out, so I can't necessarily remember if it's historically good, but I remember liking it at the time.
Oh no, it's actually a pretty good movie.
Is it? I should watch it again.
Yeah, go ahead. It's not 2 hours badly spent by any stretch of imagination.
Well, that's good, because I'm sure you've watched it a couple of times to get a sense of how fiction can lead to creating the future, essentially, and that's exactly what happened here, right? Talk a little bit about how Enemy of the State actually has something very critical to do with what we have with Gorgon Stare.
Sure. So when I started doing research about this technology, which we'll get a little bit more into what it does in a second, but very briefly, it watches a very, very wide area from the sky, essentially. People often used an analogy to explain what it looked like and how it worked, which is to say, have you seen the movie Enemy of the State? Because that's sort of the closest analog, the closest visual reference to what this technology actually does. Now, to give you a sort of plotted summary of Enemy of the State. It's a 1998 movie with Will Smith and Gene Hackman. And in the movie, Will Smith plays a lawyer in Washington, D.C., who comes into possession of some evidence that compromises, in a sense, a number of officials at the National Security Agency. And so they decide they need to get it back. And they begin to pursue him relentlessly, using all sorts of spy gadgets, some of which were real at the time and some of which were entirely fictional. They tap his phones, obviously. They plant miniature cameras in his house. There's one in his smoke detector. They put trackers in his watch and his pen and his pants and his shoes. Their most powerful tool, though, without a doubt, is their surveillance satellite. They basically get this giant satellite, park it over the eastern seaboard, and it stares down on the entire area. It seems like it looks at really the whole eastern seaboard in a sense. And it watches Dean, the lawyer, played by Will Smith, as he scuttles around trying to get away. Now, for the average viewer, the intent with that device was to spark fear and anxiety. It was meant to demonstrate that, while power is nothing new and the abuse of power is nothing new, these new technologies, these new surveillance technologies in particular, make power all the more vicious and even further rig the contest between the weak and the strong. And certainly watching the satellite tracking Will Smith around, really seeming like he has nowhere to go, is pretty terrifying. Well, one night in 1998, shortly after the movie came out, on a Friday evening in Northern California, a man who works for a government lab called the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory was attending a screening of this movie with his wife on a date night. And whereas the other members of the audience were no doubt terrified by what they saw, he was thrilled. He saw this satellite and said,
"That's a good idea.
We've got to do this," essentially. I mean, that would be amazing. And so he rushed home and picked up the phone and left a message with his supervisor. And the message was very short. He just said, "I have a great idea. Call me." And as a result of that initial call, this very small, kind of scrappy group within this very large organization started exploring this idea. If we were to do something like that, how would we go about it? What technologies would we use? And then a few years later, after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had really heated up, and U.S. service members were coming under constant attack from improvised explosive devices, the Central Intelligence Agency became very interested in the technology because they saw it as a way of countering these insurgent networks in Iraq who blended seamlessly into the local population. And from that point on, it's just been a roller coaster ride for this technology. I mean, it was rushed to deployment by 2006, and it has been operating in foreign wars ever since. Gorgon Stare is the ultimate iteration of the technology. It is the most powerful one to date, but there are dozens of other systems that have been developed or are indeed still out there. But it all began, as you say, with the 1998 thriller Enemy of the State with Will Smith.
It's like 6 Degrees of Will Smith, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
As relates to surveillance. That might be the only time that actually works, but anyways.
Yeah.
How developed was the technology in the beginning? Like I'm kind of imagining it's the sort of thing where if you've got a camera covering a wide area, and this started development as early as it did, you're not talking like seeing the details of a car down on a street. You're talking like a couple of pixels moving around, and like that's the car that we're following. Is that about what it was in the beginning?
Yeah, absolutely. And to be sure, the idea with this technology is to watch the widest possible area. Right. And so with that in mind, it doesn't matter if a car is only a couple of pixels, because what you want to do is you want to track cars and vehicles, where they're going, and also backwards in time to where they've been from, where they've come from rather. And so yes, you're very much right. It's not going to give you this perfectly crisp image where you can, watch a car, read its number plate, or recognize a person's face. But you just pass the coordinates of that vehicle that you've tracked and have decided is potentially a threat over to another camera, more like a sort of telescopic camera, if you will, and it'll be able to do that job extremely well. So the basic concept with these cameras is that you have an IED explosion, so a car bomb goes off somewhere in Baghdad. If you have the camera flying overhead at the time, you can rewind the footage and zoom into the footage to that very point in time where the explosion happened. Then you can rewind even further to see where the people involved in that attack came from. Not only that, you can also sort of move forward in the footage to see where they went. Now, the idea is that eventually the folks involved in that kind of attack will return to a safe house, some location that is associated with this terrorist group. Now that you know the location of this safe house, you can watch the other cars coming and going from that exact place. In theory, once you have connected enough locations by tracking the vehicles moving between them, you can figure out, as one former intelligence officer put it to me, you'll start to see that patterns emerge. And in theory, you'll be able to figure out what the hierarchy of the organization is, who plays which role, how they're all connected. And that's certainly catnip for someone like, an intelligence official at the Central Intelligence Agency. Yeah. They're not trying to, put steel plating on the bottom of Humvees to prevent deaths from explosions as they happen in the moment. They want to stop the next attack. They want to find the people responsible, maybe find the people responsible and extract further information from them. And that was precisely the idea with this. And it was so revolutionary because previously aerial surveillance cameras operated more like telescopes. you could see your target on the ground in very high fidelity, but you could only watch a very narrow area. And so if something happened outside of your frame of view, you had no way of capturing it. You had to sort of, rely on dumb luck. One anecdote that was given to me was that a predator with one of these telescopic cameras was being used to follow a convoy of vehicles. And there was intelligence to say that there was a senior terrorist leader inside one of these vehicles, but they didn't know exactly which one. At one point, these vehicles reached an intersection and split up. And now those watching had to make a pretty sort of stomach-churning decision. Do we go left or do we go right? Ultimately, it was basically a sort of flip of the coin, and they got it wrong. Now, if you were using one of these wide area cameras, you'd be watching the whole city. So it didn't matter if you go right or left. The camera records, as one engineer put it to me, the whole thing all the time. You can see everything, and so that problem of the telescopic camera no longer exists.
And you're listening to Northwest Tech Show on KMUZ. I'm Dave Duncan, and that was a clip from the good folks at twit.tv, Triangulation 404, talking about the real-life surveillance project called Gorgon and its origins with the 90s movie Enemy of the State with Will Smith. So, just to recap, Will Smith gets accidentally, unknowingly to him, gets some secure footage showing the criminal activity of one of the high-ups in the spy agency and, kind of doing his own rogue operation. And so rather than own up to it, he thinks, well, what we need to do is just destroy this guy's life and everyone he associates with and chase him around, as they said, all over the city using real-time updates from the satellite to call in his every move. And they had some ridiculous stuff in there too, where they took some shop cameras and virtually turned the picture around 360 degrees so they could see what was previously blocked. And it's like, yeah, you can extrapolate, but it's all a guess. If you didn't see what was on the other side, then you can't just manufacture that out of thin air. But as I said, that was pretty much candy to the eyes and mind of the of people that were actually working in surveillance, and they came up with this project called Gorgon, which it's not a video project because of the frame rate, but the idea is to take ultra high definition pictures of an entire city or region. And they did it with a spherical array of 9 cameras, each very high resolution. And they would capture, a couple of frames per second or every couple of seconds. And the pictures were high enough resolution that they could zoom into any part of it and get a pretty good idea of at least a car level of what was there. And they would, capture this all the time. And that was kind of the reference. The Gorgon stare was, was in turning to stone and no longer blinking. It was, basically it's okay. It's an unblinking eye that has a, perfect memory of every bit of movement in a city for the last, X number of days or weeks. And so anything suspicious goes on, you just start at the point of issue, and then you could, go backward in time from the incident to, as they said, see where people came from. You could go forward in time up to the current time and see, where vehicles got ditched and things like that. So, interesting project. Again, it raises the issue of, what's your expectation when used domestically. It raises the question of what's your expectation of privacy, and are you expecting every move to be recorded en masse with no suspicion of wrongdoing? Whereas the previous system was, let's zoom in on a certain area where we've got an operation going, and that's another point of view in real time that we can use. So, that was more akin to, in military terms, it was more akin to doing something with a warrant. That remains an issue, and I think the takeaway here for me is that a lot of times movies can create reality. just by painting a very vivid image of something that could happen, you cause it to be. So sort of, a lot of developments were attributed to people being inspired by Star Trek. A lot of, portable technology and non-contact medical technology, needleless injections, things like that. They started with being imagined in Star Trek. The geosynchronous orbit was something that Arthur C. Clarke created in one of his books, and they're like, "Oh yeah, that's a great idea. We can, at some orbit, the stable orbital speed going around a massive body like a planet is related to your distance above the planet's surface. So at some altitudes, you're going to be going faster than the planet turns, and some you're going to be going slower. But there's a sweet spot where the orbital speed is the same as the rate of rotation for the planet. And it's like, oh, well, if you park a satellite in that orbit, then it'll just be stationary over location. It's like, that was a radical idea at one point in time. And it's like, okay, let's do that. And the science fiction author led the way. So I guess this is, in a way, a call to, do some positive fiction, do some, hey, what are ways that, the individual can be empowered by technology and maintain a balance with the state, as opposed to it just, eventually, I think that's the way a lot of technology starts out. And then it, as it gets established, then, larger, slower, more powerful organizations take it and use it to amplify the power imbalance that already exists. So I guess it's incumbent on the individuals to, kind of keep up on the bleeding edge stuff and how it can be used in their favor, and also help establish the norms around it, because the way things are used tend to be based on several things. One is what's legal. Another one is what is profitable in the marketplace. And another one is, what's technically possible. And another one is norms. What do most people consider reasonable to use? What is considered, bad taste or tacky or, scummy if you get caught doing it. And so the more we get involved with understanding technology when it first starts to emerge, the more of a chance we have to form a socially positive norm around it before someone, starts secretly putting it to the worst possible uses. So something to keep in mind as we go forward. All right. I wanted to do I've been trying to come out some more good news stories, because I've been I've been informed that I've been skewing a little bit dark the last day or two or year or two. So it's nice. I do see some positive security stories, and it shows, what can happen when people push back and have some awareness of what's going on. So this is a clip from twit.tv. This Week in Enterprise Tech 349. D-Link finally starts to seriously address their security problems.
This is Twit.
Now, a couple of years ago, the U.S. Federal Trade Commission filed a suit that allegedly said that D-Link left thousands of customers open to potentially really super costly attacks and hacks. Now, it claimed that D-Link failed to test its gear against common security flaws ranked among the most critical and widespread by the Open Web Application Security Project. Now, it also called out, despite the lack of testing and hardening of its products, D-Link actually misrepresented its security regimen as reasonable. Now, how widespread of this issue is it from the D-Link? Well, let's go through some of the lists of issues that have come up since then. In June 2018, there was actually a malicious hacker behind the Satori Internet of Things botnet, which actually started a mass exploiting of critical code execution vulnerabilities in the D-Link hardware. And that actually caused quite a bit of problems because a lot of Verizon subscribers and other ISPs actually were attacked. Now, a month later, criminals had stolen D-Link code signing certificates and were using it to pass off malware that actually steals passwords and backdoors for PCs. Now, a month later, after that, hackers exploited a vulnerability in D-Link routers that actually sent users to actually a fake banking website that actually attempted to take their login credentials. Now, I don't know if about you, but it sounds pretty significant if you think about it. Now, let's go over some of the specifics that the FCC is saying in this particular lawsuit. Now, according to the FCC, D-Link has hard-coded login credentials on its D-Link camera software that usually is easily guessed. D-Link stored mobile app login credentials in human-readable text on its users' mobile devices. They also expressly or implicitly describing its hardware as being secure for unauthorized access. Plus, they repeatedly failed to take reasonable testing and remediation measures to protect equipment from well-known, easily preventable software flaws. Now, you fast forward 2 years until now, and there finally is a settlement. That's right. D-Link settled, and it's requiring that D-Link actually implement a bunch of a security program to ensure that it has better security on its devices. Now, the program requires, quote, implementing security planning, threat modeling, and testing for vulnerabilities before products release, ongoing monitoring to address security flaws and automatic firmware updates, as well as accepting vulnerability reports from security researchers. Plus, over the next decade, D-Link will also be required every 2 years to obtain an independent third-party assessment of its security program. Well, guys, I want to throw it to Cheebert first, because I think this is fairly interesting information. We already knew that D-Link had these issues before, but the interesting thing here is it seems like ASUS and D-Link were kind of the first set of targets, right? They're the ones that were saying, hey, these devices you've put out, they're not very secure, and we're going to go target you in hopes that we send a message down the pipe. Is this going to be the end of this? Is this the company's going to actually start saying, okay, I don't want to be the target next? What do you think, Cheebert?
No, I'm pretty sure the FTC is just going for the low-hanging fruit. The sad fact of life is, on the U.S. market today, there are hundreds, quote, hundreds of devices out there that are using some really, really old Linux kernels that have really, really old vulnerabilities on them. And these companies are still claiming them to be a secure device. California is definitely doing a bunch of things. They're actually starting to look at having a kind of a label that is for security devices on how well it will protect you. And especially people like the credit card people, PCI, they are going after them also. So if you are a provider of, quote, security equipment, this should be a wake-up call. Penetration testing, malware testing, just plain old common sense isn't that hard to do. And if you're not willing to invest, I think the FTC is going to make you invest. So watch out. Time to wake up, people.
Now, I want to throw this to Kurt, because Kurt, we've seen this in different parts of the industry where there's been a bunch of standards and principles kind of created for that part of the industry and different devices that are in them. Is this time that we have these for IoT and other devices as well? Is this going to help kind of push companies forward?
Well, I think it is going to push companies forward, but I'm going to play just a touch of the devil's advocate here, because no one misunderstand. I think that all of the changes D-Link is going to be making are good, positive changes. I mean, you should be able to change the username and password. You should be monitoring. You should be stress testing. You should be QA testing devices before they go out. All of that is good. But from their point of view, let's remember that these are, in fact, consumer devices. And when we're talking about consumer devices, we're talking about going to a market that not so many years ago featured people who would take a piece of tape and put it over the display of their VCR because they couldn't figure out how to make the time stop blinking 12 o'clock forever. So if that's the level of technical sophistication you're dealing with, you can understand why a manufacturer might not initially leap to make things configurable and changeable. Just set it up, let it go out, and assume that no one really cares about Joe and Jane Average's IP camera feed. Problem, of course, is that we found out that people do, in fact, care about Joe and Jane Average's camera feed. And more than that, they care about the processing power that lives in their IP camera. So I think what we're going to have here is a necessary uptick in the level of sophistication of not only D-Link's devices, but a lot of other manufacturer devices. And we're going to have an awful lot of devices deployed in the field that never, ever change off the default username and password.
I think you're right. I think the majority of the population today, I think Leo had told a funny story, I think last week on his radio show about a woman who called in and she says, I don't have internet anymore. And she said, well, what internet do you connect to? And she says, Linksys. And he said, well, does that mean you were using just some random person's internet? And she said, yeah, I never entered anything. It just kind of worked. And just goes to show you, people buy these devices, they leave the no passwords on the Wi-Fi, and they get them hooked up to the internet. And I think that that's kind of a bad thing, especially for companies who, it should probably have security out of the box. Now, granted, it means that the user experience does become more difficult. And I've seen a trend of making things more secure by using special, unique user experiences to make it easier. Now, I want to throw this to Cheever, because Cheever, you've been using IoT devices for a while. You've seen kind of how bad the security has been in them. Has it gotten better, and has maybe the setup of them gotten worse?
Okay, so IoT devices in general are slowly getting better. Like I mentioned in my blip, Node-RED, when I first played with it about 5 years ago, did not even have a way for login credentials. That has definitely changed. A lot of things have changed. WinSocket, Lou, you and I were bouncing some sample code back and forth when I was trying to eat the learning curve on WinSocket. And one of the things that you and I both noticed very quickly is a lot of the so-called Node-RED WinSocket servers and so forth, the security was almost non-existent.
That's right. Yeah.
But as I was going through all the notes on GitHub, on their websites, user forums and things like that, the general public that are playing with IoT are pushing back and saying, hey, this isn't acceptable. If I'm going to be paying for, say a dynamic DNS device so that I can go and upload my power data, that I've tinkered with, I would really like to have a little bit more security. So the good news is John Q. Public is starting to push back and saying, hey, I don't want my devices to be abused by a botnet herder. I would much rather have them be a little more secure, and I want to learn for it. Let me go and throw some very nice kudos to the Ubiquiti people. Their new AC Wi-Fi router was an interesting compromise. They actually have their Wi-Fi passwords and admin passwords are randomly generated, and they're 12 digits long. To get around the problem of John Q. Public not being able to remember that thing, they've actually put QR codes on the bottom of their new AC routers so that you can get logged in and use it without having to understand what a 12-bit random generated password really is representing. So I think we've got some baby steps happening, and I think our friends at the FTC are on the right track. Let's go and wave the stick in the air, but have a carrot in the other hand saying, hey, get on the bandwagon right now, make it more secure, and we'll leave you alone. So maybe, just maybe, we might actually start seeing the Internet of Things become the Internet of Secure Things, instead of how Padre used to like saying it's called the Internet of Insecure Things.
That's right. Yeah. In fact, I've used some of the Eero devices, who actually are a sponsor of Twit shows. But I've actually used them before, set their devices up, and I can tell you that the kind of the orchestration between your mobile phone and the device has really kind of made it easier for you to set passwords up, set up security, make sure that's connected to the correct nodes that are more secure and are secure as well. So I think the companies are trying to make it easier for these types of things, especially for people who are not like the tech savvy type people. But hopefully they'll do it and it'll be more behind the scenes in the future.
And you're listening to Northwest Tech Show on KMUZ. That was a Creative Commons clip from the good folks at twit.tv. This week in Enterprise Tech 349, using the example of D-Link starting to address security under some direct negotiations with them from being sued and such. It's really good to see this start of pushback from the public on, hey, don't give us junk security. Again, I'm Dave Duncan. I'm joined today by Nate Darnell. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Doing well enough. All right. So, what do you think? Printing the router passwords on QR code?
I think that's certainly a creative option.
Yeah.
I think, though, for me, it ties into the idea of kind of like with education in general, there's like this diminishing level of skill in basic arithmetic and writing. Yeah. And you just expect the technology to do it for you, and
just point your smartphone at this, and it'll do something.
And eventually, you lose an understanding of how it's actually working. So when, for whatever reason, it doesn't work, you're really out in left field. You're unable to balance a basic checkbook. Not that those exist anymore. You don't know basic finances. You can't read or write anymore. Life comes to a grinding halt. If the store shuts down, you starve to death. And so there's all of these small little things that your capacity for navigating life just begins eroding out from beneath you without you even recognizing it. And so that's my concern with making a lot of these things automatic instead of walking people through the processes. Now, that being said, it's like, look, I don't want to have to hotwire my car every single day, and put duct tape on hoses, right? And so where's the happy medium, I guess, is the real question.
Yeah, there has to be, I think, education built into the process. So security where you don't make it, where you make it too difficult is security that doesn't get used. It's like, oh, I got to have a password. Okay, fine. I'll make my password. PASSWO, all that. So that's what you get sometimes. Now you say, okay, well, we're going to make them have a good password by doing a QR code. Then they just point their phone at it and it automatically enters it and blah, blah, blah. Well, you're making a lot of assumptions about how it's going to be used. You're assuming that if you have physical access to the Wi-Fi router, it must be in your home or in your business or whatever. Anyone who has physical access to it must have access to the Wi-Fi. And maybe that's not the case. And it also introduces a vector. If you're just like, you get people in the used to scanning QR codes willy-nilly, then you're going to make them vulnerable to QR code attacks where someone just prints an alternative malicious QR code, puts it over the decal on the router, and when they do that QR code, it hacks their phone instead of giving you access to Wi-Fi.
Right. So what were those books when we were kids where you could read them and select your own outcome?
Yeah, choose your own adventure stories.
Choose your own adventure. See, I think we should have choose your own installation process. So you can choose push button automatic, you can choose training wheels mode, or you can choose gauntlet mode.
I'm ready for some learning.
That's right.
Power up mode. Yeah, educational mode. Sure. I mean, I could see a service where you just get connected with a tutor on that specific subject. It's like, go to this web address and a technician who knows this product will, for 99 cents every 10 minutes or something, we'll just walk you through it.
Yeah, so I think there are two things. I think, number one, there's an important aspect to always having, especially in modern times, free software and open source technologies where perhaps they may not be on the bleeding edge, but nonetheless, you've got multiple eyes, you've got multiple graduate students looking at these things. So if you are the kind of person that you're just like, hey, man, I love my kit car, I'm just going to sit in my garage and build it because that's what I do, you can do that. But for the average person that might have a job, might have a family, might have kids, doesn't have time to build a kit car in their garage or the inclination, they're like, look, I just need something with a steering wheel with 4 wheels that actually stops when it's supposed to and goes when it's supposed to.
And they give you an RC car.
Right. And well, and
that's specified.
Yes. And to to that end, the manufacturers who make those are held to certain standards of safety and reliability, right? And so it's the same thing with a lot of this computer technology, which is for many years the challenge has been that the technology is progressing so much faster than the regulatory constraints around it, and so how do you put in expectations, for safe usage in society? And historically, I mean, it's like, oh my goodness, my router died. It's not like your life died, right? And so, but as we become more integrated with the whole system, from our personal profiles on social media, which are being used for business purposes and so on and so forth, having technology that doesn't work reliably can actually have a legitimately detrimental effect.
Yeah, it can be worse than not having it at all.
Right.
All right. So let's move on to Congress addressing the issues of face recognition being applied to databases that it was never intended to be used for. So this will be a clip from the good folks at twit.tv, Security Now 722.
This is Twit.
So remember all those crime shows 20 years ago where a computer's facial recognition system would bring up a photo of some suspect, and that big photo is always over on the left-hand side of the screen. I don't know why it's always on the left, but that's where it always is. And then a bunch of lines would be drawn over it by a computer to form a facial recognition map. And then over to the right, and it also is always over on the right, the upper right of the screen, the computer would then scan through a gazillion faces, like, just flicker through them super fast, presumably pretending to be matching them. And suddenly sometimes it would slow down if it was a cheesy show, or it would just stop, which is what you would hope, because it's not a roulette wheel. And you would be looking at the matching face. And then after a dramatic pause to make sure the audience had all caught up, the personal details of the individual's criminal record would paint down the screen below the matching photo. So we've been seeing that for decades. And it was never true. It turns out it's true now. This is one of those things which has sort of quietly happened, and it's being done at a level that surprises people who haven't been really paying attention. We've got, as we know, this explosion in mass storage that allows everything to be stored. Just that. It's like not what is being stored. The answer is everything is being stored. And we've got crazy computational power. We've got a jump in AI capabilities recently enabled by the crazy jump in computational power. And so this is all what used to be fiction is now absolutely happening. ZDNet picked up on some coverage in the Washington Post, which did some investigative reporting based on work conducted by Georgetown Law's Center on Privacy and Technology. Over the past 5 years, researchers at Georgetown issued public records requests, which have revealed that federal investigators, specifically the FBI and ICE, have turned state departments of motor vehicles databases into what they described as a bedrock of unprecedented surveillance infrastructure. And to be clear, this doesn't appear to be a direct violation of any privacy laws. And this is sort of one of the points of this podcast, is that technology is often enabling things for which society has not caught up.
We gave them our pictures for those driver's licenses, never thinking what the consequences might be once face recognition became widespread.
Exactly.
And there's nothing you can do now, right? I mean, that's it. It's done.
Yes, our face is out.
Grow a beard.
Anyway, in a recent congressional testimony,
I did read, and you got to do this. That you don't know what Juggalo makeup is, but you can look it up. Juggalo makeup effectively obscures face recognition. So I think get ready. There's going to be an invasion of Juggalos.
Uh-oh.
Well, yeah, uh-oh is right. I'll pull up a Juggalo while you continue, and you'll see what I'm talking about.
Okay. In recent congressional testimony, members were not happy. And having watched more than my share of congressional testimony, no one wants to have Jim Jordan, who is a very, shall we say, excitable and interactively aggressive Republican congressman
he's scary.
from Ohio.
This is really scary. This guy is wearing Juggalo makeup, just so you know now.
Well, Leo, if my mother wore that, I wouldn't know who she was.
Right. It works. And I suspect We're going to live in a sci-fi future where people are walking around with this weird makeup. It comes from a band called the Insane Clown Posse. I'll leave it at that.
People don't like clowns. Like, this is really this is bad.
Juggalos are scary.
So, as the Washington Post put it, Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio, the House Oversight Committee's ranking Republican, seemed particularly incensed during a hearing into the technology last month at the use of driver's license photos in federal facial in federal facial recognition searches without the approval of state legislators or individual license holders. Jordan said, quote, "They've just given access to that to the FBI. No individual signed off on that when they renewed their driver's license or got their driver's licenses. They didn't sign any waiver saying, oh, it's okay to turn my information, my photo, over to the FBI. No elected officials voted for that to happen," unquote.
Presumably they didn't need to, though, right? I mean,
but that's my point, is that we've just jumped ahead of legislation. The Washington Post said, despite those doubts, federal investigators have turned facial recognition into a routine investigative tool. Since 2011, the FBI has logged more than 390,000 facial recognition searches of federal and local databases, including state DMV databases, the Government Accountability Office said last month. And the records show that federal investigators have forged daily working relationships with DMV officials. In Utah alone, FBI and ICE agents logged more than 1,000 facial recognition searches between 2015 and 2017, the records show. Names and other details are hidden, though dozens of the searches are marked as having returned a possible match, unquote. The Washington Post said back in May, both Democrats and Republicans blast facial recognition technology in a rare bipartisan moment. A committee hearing becomes the venue for worries about privacy and civil rights. They wrote, facial recognition technology endured fierce resistance in Washington on Wednesday, that was May 22nd, as both Republican and Democratic lawmakers criticized the artificial intelligence software, and this, by the way, comes from Amazon, as a danger to Americans' privacy and civil rights. At a time when most issues in Washington generate a starkly partisan divide, members of the House Oversight and Reform Committee were startlingly bipartisan in their condemnation of the technology, which federal and local law enforcement agencies are already using across the country to identify suspects caught on camera. Members blasted the largely unregulated technology as inaccurate, invasive, and having potentially chilling effects on Americans' privacy and free expression rights. Several voiced support for passing federal laws to restrain the technology's use before, as Representative Mark Meadows, a Republican from North Carolina, said, it gets out of control. Others voiced worries about the technology being used in the United States as it is in China, where it is critical to the government's systems of public monitoring and social control. The committee chairman, Elijah Cummings, said, quote, there's a lot of agreement among lawmakers that the technology should be regulated. The question, he said, is whether the system should face a moratorium while the technology is assessed or refined, or whether it should be banned outright. The committee's ranking Republican, that's Jim Jordan, who I mentioned before, compared the technology to Big Brother in the dystopian George Orwell novel 1984, and said it threatened Americans' First and Fourth Amendment rights covering free speech and protections against unreasonable searches. Quote, seems to me it's time for a timeout, he said. Doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, this should concern us all.
And you're listening to Northwest Tech Show on KMUZ. That was a Creative Commons clip from twit.tv. That was Security Now 722. Addressing Congress, and they're finally turning their attention to face recognition and mission creep for databases. I'm Dave Duncan. I'm here with Nate Darnell. And this has been something that we have talked about and other technologists, aware people have talked about for quite some time, which is things collected for one purpose being used for another, generally with the ignorance of the people whose privacy is being basically thrown in the garbage. you have your driver's license pictures and such, so you can, be identified as someone who has, received training in a car and, has had in mission creep has had that as state authentication of your identity. And now with the updated, what do they call that? There's some name now for the national program of bringing all driver's licenses up to a certain security standard so they can start to be used in place of things like passports. Like you can, with a, enhanced ID passport, real ID, that's what it was. So you need birth certificates and all sorts of things in order to be associated with that driver's license. So partially to make it harder for people who are not actual citizens to get driver's licenses and things like that. There's been a lot of controversy about even that, just because, the alternative, when you make it difficult to get licensed based on if you're here legally or not, then you're going to have more unlicensed drivers, and that'd be a danger. But here we're talking about the mission creep that here's this big pile of pictures. Let's start applying our computers to them and using them for a manner they were never intended, involving people in cases because maybe they look like a suspect. This technology also has a very high fail rate with non-white faces, so that false matches happen much more often for, say, African Americans, anyone with a different complexion than the data set on which the face recognition system was trained. So I don't know. What do you think? This with a warrant, or this with a new disclaimer when you go to DMV, or what's your issue here?
Well, I think there should clearly be a notification that it's being done. I have mixed feelings about it, because I do think that it could be used to rapidly identify people for a legal case, like if there was, say, a murder and an assault or so on and so forth. At the same time, it's clearly disconcerting or concerning because of what's happening in China regarding like the social credit score, and how quickly this is like
mission
creeping towards that.
Creepy mission creep.
Yes.
Yeah. I think this is also another example, like we were talking about with the Gorgon Stare project coming out of the movie Enemy of the State. I think after 10 years of seeing Hawaii Five-0 and NCIS and all these other shows doing what he described, it's like, run a face match on this, and then ticking through a database. Oh, here he is. Just by seeing that in fiction, it makes it much easier for people to just say, oh, this feels like an established, now we're technically able to do it. It feels like an accepted thing already because a TV show has it, rather than, hey, we as a society need to look at this and do we want to do this?
Right.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, let's move into wrapping up the show here with just a little fun. Well, actually, this is kind of an important piece, so I'll get into this. Twit.tv, Creative Commons. This is all about Android 427, talking about partially easing the Huawei restrictions. That's the major Chinese smartphone that was put on a kind of a blacklist because on the premise that the Chinese government could possibly be influencing them, and possibly really because they were coming out with 5G and they needed to throw some, basically kneecap them before they became the global standard in 5G, which would be a disadvantage to American companies. So here is all about Android 427.
This is Twit.
We've been tracking the Huawei drama. I feel like this is the soap opera of Huawei.
No longer a security threat to the United States of America.
Well, there's Flo. Do you want to do the story?
No. Sorry.
So we try to avoid politics generally on the show, but it's hard with this story to avoid it. But in a stunning, unprecedented 180 and turnaround by the American government, Huawei has now been deemed that American companies can do business with them once again, which puts Huawei back in the mix in the Android world. Now, it doesn't take Huawei completely out of the fire. Huawei is still on the Commerce Department's entity list, which means that they're still on, dealing with the China-U.S. relations. But this statement by the American government allows Google and Intel and Qualcomm and other companies to provide services to Huawei. And basically, this all happened at the G20 summit, or coming out of the G20 summit, where the U.S. and China have resumed trade talks. And, whatever you want to say about all that. But I, for one, am disappointed by this news because I really wanted to see what Huawei came up with an alternate operating system for Android. And I hope this doesn't mean we'll never see it. Matteo, have you been tracking the drama of Huawei? I assume you have been.
Yes, I have been, and it's been very, very interesting to see posturing at both sides of this story.
Indeed.
Both the U.S. government and the Chinese government and Huawei, and essentially the narrative hasn't changed that much over the last few months. What has changed, I think, is from the U.S. side, how many U.S. businesses were starting to be negatively affected by this. Google, for example, couldn't really go into a new product release cycle with the next version of Android, Android 10, with the second largest smartphone manufacturer in the world not being fully on board with their flavor of Android. So I think this is something that has been on the cards for a while. It's just been put off. And we're back to business as usual with Huawei and US businesses. The issue will be, I think, more in the long run. How will this affect Huawei's commitment to new versions of Android? How dependent will they want to be on US businesses going forward to avoid this issue happening again? This was going to be very interesting to watch, and also to see how other Chinese smartphone manufacturers, companies like Oppo, Xiaomi, and others, how much are they going to want to depend on US relations to make their products. So whilst we won't see Hongmeng, Huawei's own operating system that runs Android apps, in the near future, it won't be as far back on the back burner as it used to be. I think that this will be actively developed a little bit more.
I'm going to be curious how this trickles down to other Chinese companies. I mean, is this just going to make people scared to work with us? Because
that's the thing, is that this threat will be hanging over all Chinese U.S. relations.
It's a political thing now. This is a political thing, so it's not just business. This was solved at the G20 summit, which is a very political thing.
Yeah. And the thing is, after you.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying, I'm sure there was also a little bit of hinting from the Chinese government along the lines of, oh, you have all these fruity devices and container vessels about to be shipped over to the US. I think you need to fill in Form P30 and Mate 20 Pro before we can let these container vessels leave port. Think of how damaging potentially it could be to have a year with no iPhone release because of this trade war.
Oh, overseas, you mean?
Well, let's not go too far, Matteo. How damaging could it? I mean, like,
it would be great for the Android ecosystem.
We do love conspiracy theories here at All About Android.
That's the real challenge. Where do we embrace our patriotism or our loyalty to the green Android character? But no, you got to hope that it doesn't, start this, if this trade, conflict continues or takes another turn, it doesn't impact services like shipping and stuff like that. Because not just because of think how damaging it will be if a shipment of phones don't get there, but think how damaging if a shipment of the long list of products that are now made in China don't make it to the U.S. Things that we've become dependent on because manufacturing's left this country, and so it's definitely a delicate issue, and it's interesting to see Huawei become the political football that was kind of in the middle of it. And if I'm Huawei, I don't stop developing Hongmeng. You keep doing everything you're doing.
Now they need a backup plan.
Yeah, because guess what? Next week he can go in the opposite direction again. There's no guarantee here. No.
True. But let's face it, Huawei have been essentially Google-less in China since they started making smartphones. it's nothing new to them. It's just they had to have a compelling product for outside of China without Google services, which was the interesting challenge they would have had. Luckily for us and the majority of consumers outside China, this hasn't had to happen. But I'm sure that that Huawei will be constantly thinking about what are they going to do without depending on U.S. businesses that much.
And you're listening to Northwest Tech Show on KMUZ. That was a Creative Commons clip from twit.tv. That was all about Android 427, talking about the United States easing the restrictions on Huawei. So now that American companies can ship them the parts they need for their phones, it just the sales of the actual phones is, I think, still at issue. So, yeah, this was a pretty big shot in the general tech commerce. All of a sudden, it's like, wow, we can't trust our parts coming from the U.S. And for the U.S. manufacturers, it was like, wait, we can't sell our stuff.
Right.
For Android, it was, wait, we're not going to be on the second largest handset anymore in the world. Okay, all right, that's good. Yay.
that was basically a Chinese touche, correct? From our.
Well, no. I mean, it was entirely self-inflicted. It was like we said, oh, we've decided we got a bee in our bonnet that maybe Huawei, might be under the influence of the Chinese government because it's in China.
Right.
Or maybe it's because they were about to roll out some really well done 5G technology and everyone in the world would have bought it because they got there before we did.
Right.
So they said, oh, we're going to put them on the list like they're terrorists or something, and no American company can do business with them. You can't buy from them. You can't sell to them. And all of a sudden they realized the sell to them was a problem. So they're sticking with really what we just want is we don't want anyone to buy their stuff. So we'll just do that part. We can still sell parts to them because, whatever. So, these are the moves that are hard to walk back. Once you've essentially said you're willing to sentence a foreign company to death by, destroying its market and all its sources for parts and technology without any serious evidence of wrongdoing it whatsoever, it's like, oh, well, okay. So we better make sure we don't rely on you then, which means we're not going to follow your leadership anymore, unfortunately. So we'll see how that pans out.
So does this mean that Android could die?
No, Android was fine. The issue was, let's, I don't know, competition's good. They're definitely going to have to create a Chinese-based competitor to Android because the U.S. can't be trusted to, not go back on their deals or, drop a hammer on them without any evidence. So I'm like, okay, fine. You want to play that? We'll play that. So, that's going to have repercussions that'll really start shining in 5 to 10 years, I think. So we'll see. But anyway, I'm glad they eased that restriction because I think that was a bad precedent to just outright destroy a company for no apparent reason. And it also did a lot of harm to all the companies that were, that they were selling, stuff to. So anyway, with that, we're going to wrap up the show. Just a reminder, technology, understanding it, and pushing back and creating norms that are more in alignment with our values can create better outcomes at home, at work, and in your civic engagements. So I hope you'll join us to continue this conversation next Wednesday and every Wednesday, noon to 1 o'clock on Northwest Tech Show.